Today's title is The Imperial I When the Self Becomes the Arbiter of Morality. Actually, I'm quite sure all of you probably remember what it was like back in the 1960s when things started to change, when the culture in this country started to change somewhat. The 60s was a time when young people began to sort of go their own way, so to speak. They didn't necessarily accept the institutions and the values and the way of life of a generation past. I think there were a lot of reasons for that. The Vietnam War was part of it. But, you know, if you look at American history as a whole, it's interesting how it really wasn't until after World War II that America became this big, highly affluent society. I mean,
I can give you an example of one of the major changes we remember.
Yeah.
In college, in the dorm, there was no more curfew.
Oh.
And it went from really rigorous curfew and having to clean the steps if you were late or anything, to getting a key and coming and going on your own.
Oh, okay.
It all happened from the end of freshman year to the start of sophomore year. So
is that right? Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was a big deal.
That was a big deal. Yeah. 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 Well, there was this idea in the 60s that that young people were going to start to go their own way, okay? And this resulted in some cultural changes that had some lasting impacts on the way people think about values and morality, about a lot of things, religion, and so forth. And I'm not just talking about, Woodstock and the experimenting with drugs and that sort of thing. I'm talking about the idea that if you, well, let me back up and put it this way. One of the things I found interesting when I first moved to Maryland, we lived in suburban Baltimore. And there's Baltimore, there's the city itself, which is surrounded by a freeway called the Beltway. And then there's another one that goes into the center of town. And then there's a row of older suburbs. And then the further out you go, you get to the newer suburbs. So the further out you go, the nicer things become. Because what was built later on was built for people who had more money than what was built in the earlier years. Well, in any case, Baltimore was a city of neighborhoods, kind of like New York City is, or at least used to be. And each neighborhood had a name. The one I lived in was called Fullerton. There was Overley. There was Hamilton. There was a number of them. And in the center of each neighborhood, there was a big church. Could be a Catholic church, could be a Methodist church, could be a Lutheran church. It depended on the ethnicity of the people who lived in that neighborhood, right? So prior to World War II, most people grew up and stayed in their home neighborhood. Nobody had any reason to move anywhere. So, but once after World War II, and once people began to become more affluent, the idea was that young people ought to, if it was possible, get a college education, because a college education was seen as something you had to have in order to become successful, to move forward and get a good job and earn a decent income and all. You had to have a college education. So what happened as a result of that is that the young people who used to stay in these neighborhoods ended up experiencing different places because they would go away to school, right? So some of them would go off to Notre Dame. Some of them would go off to some other universities on the East Coast. Some others would go to someplace else. Anyway, young people began to move to different parts of the country, at least while they were in school. And while they were in school, they experienced the world in a completely different way than they had when they remained in their own home neighborhoods. In their own home neighborhoods, everybody had the same values, belonged to the same church. The social life of the community tended to center on the church, on youth groups and women's organizations and things like that. So when young people began to experience other parts of the country, and when they started to get an education, especially in the humanities, where they learned about the fact that different cultures have different ways of looking at things, different moral outlooks, different values, different religions, they began to understand more and more how diverse the world is. Because previous to that, they tended to be more parochial, okay? More just a part of their own group, a part of their own clan. So, and as a result of that, many young people at that point began to see their ultimate commitments in life, whether that be religious, whether that be their values, whether that be their moral outlook, all of this stuff. They began to see that, well, why should I just accept the way I was raised? I can, go off and adopt different ways of thinking and different values and different ways of doing things. And out of that developed what D'Souza calls secular morality, as opposed to traditional morality. Now, secular and traditional isn't the same thing as religious and non-religious. I mean, secular tends not to be tied to any particular religion, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have religious connections. And traditional doesn't necessarily mean, that it's tied to a specific religion, okay? It's just a matter of what's traditional and what might be something that represents a new way of looking at things. Okay, so he talks about the difference there, and that's what I want to get into a little bit today, if I can find where I'm at here in my my lecture. Okay, so in traditional morality tends to see moral norms as external to ourselves. In other words, a good example of that would be the Ten Commandments. Okay, the Ten Commandments is a traditional moral code. Written codes of moral behavior tend to be traditional because they've been handed down from generation to generation to generation. Okay, so they're external to yourself. It's something that you feel accountable to. It's not something that you freely chose. It's something that comes to you from some form of authority. Okay, so in a traditional moral situation, you're talking about a situation where there's some kind of moral authority of some kind, be that a religious authority or the authority of the state or whatever it might be. Okay, secular morality, on the other hand, is based on the idea. Let me introduce this by asking you a question. Back in the 60s, did you ever hear the phrase where people would say, I need to go on a journey to find myself? Did you ever hear that?
Oh yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I heard that all the time.
Yeah.
I need to find myself. Okay, well, if you don't have a pre-existing foundation that serves as the basis for defining who you are and what you believe, now you're free to choose for yourself, right? Okay, so when we're talking about secular morality, we're talking about morality that people choose of their own accord. Okay, so some of the issues that arose out of the 60s, and they became particularly debated a lot when we got into the 70s, were issues such as abortion, issues such as gay rights and gay marriage, and issues such as divorce, a more sort of less stringent way of looking at people's sexuality and what is right and what is wrong in that regard. So when we're talking about secular morality, what we're really talking about is a morality that is based on the idea that my values and my morals are something that I find within myself. Okay, it's like it's as if you believed that you were born with a certain nature, like a flower. You plant a flower, and if it's a lily, it's going to come up and it's going to look like a lily. It's not going to look like a rose or a tulip. It's just going to look like a lily. Okay, so if you believe that you have a certain nature, then the point of life is going to be to develop who you are. And that means, among other things, your expression of, what your values are and what your moral outlook is and your lifestyle. All of that is something that comes from within yourself. You get to choose that for yourself. Have you ever heard the phrase, "Don't impose your morality on me"? Have you ever heard anybody ever say that? Yeah. Okay, that was another thing that came out of that, because if everybody's free to choose for themselves, then it wouldn't be legitimate for another person to tell you, what your values ought to be. That's your personal business. It's not their business. Okay. So, the idea that other people shouldn't have the authority to tell you what to believe and how to behave, as long as, quote, you're not hurting anybody else, unquote, as long as you're not doing that, then you should be free. In fact, there was a book that came out. I remember this. I don't remember how long ago the book came out, but do you remember this book entitled "Free to Be You and Me"? Did you ever hear of that book?
Yeah.
Yeah. That was based on this idea. Free to be who we are, right? Free to develop into the persons we want to be. And the interesting thing about this is that it had an enormous impact on all kinds of areas of life. So, for example, think of the Oprah Winfrey show. Anybody watch Oprah?
Yeah.
Yeah, you watch Oprah? Yeah. Oprah's show comes out of this tradition because one of the things Oprah did, she was a pioneer in this, was that she would bring people in and have conversations with them and let them define for her and her audience who they are and what their values are. Okay, so she was a pioneer in this area, and there were others as well, but she was probably the most famous one. Now, it's not like this is necessarily something that's brand new. There was a French philosopher by the name of JeanJacques Rousseau. Have you ever heard of JeanJacques Rousseau? Yeah.
Yep.
JeanJacques Rousseau lived back in the 1700s, and he believed that everybody had a natural self. Okay, in fact, he had this theory that human beings, if human beings were allowed to be in their natural state, kind of like, the animal kingdom is in its natural state. If human beings were left in their natural state, they would just grow into loving, happy, joyful, wonderful people. They would just develop into that. So for Rousseau, the enemy to becoming who you really are was the society you lived in, because the society you lived in imposes certain standards of right and wrong, and whatever culture you have is going to communicate certain values, and so forth. So for Rousseau, the enemy really was society. And the goal was to somehow free yourself from the shackles of what your society tried to impose on you, and to naturally become the person that you were born to be. Okay, so what's important about the idea of secular values, first of all, is to understand that they come from the idea that we have an inner self, and that inner self ought to be allowed to develop according to its own nature. And of course, Rousseau believed that human beings were basically, that their nature was basically good, so that if they were left alone, you know, they would grow into basically good people. Okay. This leads to a number of developments with respect to moral thinking that de Souza gets into here. For example, if you believe that you just develop naturally, okay, and you fall in love with another human being, okay, if you fall in love with another human being, that somehow or another means that is going to stay that way perpetually. In other words, your love is going to last eternally. It's going to last forever once you fall in love. But as it turns out, does that actually usually work?
Not always.
Not always.
50% of the time it works.
It works for some of us.
Yeah.
About 50%.
Yeah, about 50%. That's about right. Yeah, about 50%. You know, there's also, you know, the other thing that grew out of this was the idea that, you know, prior to this notion of secular ethics, it was considered, well, let me express this by telling you a story. There was a family that lived in our neighborhood in Minot. And unfortunately, the wife was being abused by her husband, who was an alcoholic. That often happens when you've got an alcoholic situation. Abuse goes along with it. And unfortunately, because her family felt that a divorce would put shame on the whole family, they pressured her to stay in the marriage, even though she was being abused. And the really sad thing about this is that eventually it got so bad for her that she ended up in a state mental institution because she just couldn't take it. The abuse was so bad. Okay. So when this idea of a more free moral expression came along, unfortunately, one of the things that came with it was the idea that, well, you know, if some guy decides that he'd like to have a fling with his secretary, that wasn't, you know, all that unusual. Happened a lot. I think it still does. Adultery was not, became far more prevalent. So, you know, there's always two sides to something, but the other thing that became more prevalent was that oftentimes people who were married and who began to grow apart, and that happens sometimes for a lot of different reasons. People begin to grow apart. Because divorce became so acceptable, people began to see divorce as a way out of a situation that was kind of like a prison. They just wanted out, right? Because they felt, you know, constrained by being stuck in this relationship that was not, you know, they didn't love this person anymore. And well, the victims in most cases of situations like that were not either one of the married couples. It was the children who ended up being the victims of that. Okay, so but really, the bottom line here that we have to sort of decide when we think about whether there is such a thing as an objective morality, or if morality is something that we just choose on our own. And like I say, as long as we're not hurting somebody else. Really, the underlying question is, when you look deep down inside yourself, what do you find? What do all of us tend to find as a part of who we really are? I mean, realistically, what do we find about ourselves?
Basically good.
We're basically good?
Yeah.
Okay. What else do we find?
Self-centered.
Well, we have a soul.
Do we find the desire to sometimes harm other people? Do we sometimes find within ourselves a certain amount of jealousy?
Sure.
Do we sometimes find within ourselves the desire to lust after other people? Or do we find within ourselves sometimes the desire to harm someone who we feel has harmed us? I mean, my point is that human beings, you can't simply define human beings as all one thing or all another thing, right?
Right.
We all have good qualities. Well, I mean, I guess you could find a few examples, but anyway, your average guy, okay, your average woman or man has a lot of good qualities. Most people want to be helpful to others. Most people want to be a benefit to their community. Most people want to raise their children in the best way possible. You know, we all have these good qualities, but the fact of the matter is that we also have those qualities, if we're honest about ourselves, and I'll be honest about myself. If we use the Ten Commandments as a standard, I guess I can't think of one that I have been perfectly without blame. Okay, so part of the problem with a purely secular way of looking at things is that it can unleash an excuse to do things that in fact will in some way, shape, or form harm other people. Okay. I remember one gal who came to see me once. This was when I was at my first church back in Maryland. And she found out that her husband had been stepping out on her. And she wasn't sure what to do. She wasn't sure if she should divorce the guy or try to patch it up or whatever. He wanted to try to patch it up. I wasn't going to tell her what to do. But one thing that I saw was the enormous amount of pain that this woman experienced because of what her husband did. I mean, it was an extremely painful thing for her. And I suppose that's why, in the case of adultery, there's very, very few marriages that are healed after something like that happens. You know? Yeah. Okay, so that's basically what I have today. I didn't have a whole lot of time.
So will we meet on the 14th?
Yeah, we'll pick it up again the week after.
And are there any chapters that you'd like us to look at?
Yeah. Let me look that up. Let's see. Okay, so I'd like to move on to the next section because that interests me more. It's chapter 25, the uniqueness of Jesus. So we'll do chapter 25, and we might get into chapter 26 as well. In fact, I'm pretty certain we will. So, yeah.
Happy Easter, everybody. Safe travels.
Okay. You too.